Welcome to the Hidden Corners, where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur, as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind.
This is Book 5 of the Wolfman Chronicles. It's episode 61. This is chapter 10, The Wilderness of the Heart, and it's in Alaska. Now Vitya was dead, his body covered with a blanket in the back of Jack's pickup. As they began the long drive back to Circle, Natya sat silently staring out the window, trying to imagine what life would be like now without the iron fist of Vitya defining her every move. Freedom. That was a word she was unfamiliar with. She let that word drift through her thoughts over and over again, tasting its meaning. Their lives under Vitya's tutelage, trained to be mercenaries from such a young age, that's all they knew. She glanced at Igor, deep in thought, and reached her hand across to the back seat. He took her hand with his and gently squeezed it, giving her a soft smile. Was he contemplating what life would be like, now that he too was free from the organization? Or would he want to return to Russia and start a new life without her? She wanted to talk to him, make plans, laugh and shout and jump for joy. And yet they both sat quietly, staring out the windows as the miles passed before them. Jack's thoughts were with Sasha. Where was she? He had no doubt that Vitya's appearance in Fairbanks had something to do with her disappearance. He regretted not being able to ask Vitya where Sasha might be, where he might have hidden her. He hadn't intended on killing Vitya. He needed information from him, but that white wolf came out of nowhere and tore Vitya's throat wide open, nearly ripping the head off from the shoulders with its massive jaws. How was he going to find Sasha now? And who was this white wolf? The air inside the truck felt heavy, as though it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Outside, the trees loomed, their shadows stretched like ghostly figures, shrouded in the silvery glow of the moon. Jack's fingers tightened around the wheel. His mind spun with thoughts of Sasha and her connection to this tangled web. The image of Vitya's torn, lifeless body flashed in his mind, the final, brutal scene playing over and over. Well, for now, Jack's only focus would be on finding Sasha and bringing her home. Only miles away, Sasha leaned her head against the cold window of Carl's truck, watching the dark Alaskan wilderness blur by. Her thoughts were tangled, frayed with worry. She knew Vitya was here. She had heard Vern and Al talking when they'd tied her up in the shed. She also knew just how dangerous he was. There was a good chance Vitya would be staying at the same location that he'd sent Natya and Igor to when they'd first arrived in Fairbanks. That safe house where they kept the equipment that allowed them to communicate with Russia without any detection. It had been used by spies for the Russian government for years and years. Sasha knew exactly where it was and what it was used for. And Vitya's arrival had complicated everything. His shadow loomed like a dark cloud over her, and she feared for Jack, for her daughter, and for Igor, for everyone caught in this deadly game. Beside her, Carl drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, his rugged face set in determination. Now, how about you tell me what we're facing when we get to whatever this place is that you're heading to, he asked her. Sasha knew she could trust Carl. He'd already proven that he wasn't out to harm her, and he was certainly going out of his way to drive her, Juanita, and Julian all the way back to Fairbanks to try to warn Jack of Vitya's presence. Now, from the back seat, Juanita cleared her throat and threw a sideways glance towards Julian. She wasn't sure she believed the story of Sasha's kidnapping, escape, and how she ultimately ended up in this man's wolf trap. In her mind, Carl seemed far too comfortable with Sasha, especially considering he'd supposedly seen her transform from a wolf to a woman. What man wouldn't have shot first and tried to sort things out later? Sasha explained to Carl. Well, this man Vitya that is looking for me, well, he's Russian, and he's a very bad man. It was one of his men that kidnapped me and tied me up in that shed. You already know that I escaped, and you also know the rest of the story of how I ended up in your wolf trap. So this man, Vitya, is the head of a criminal organization in Russia that provides services for the government. They are mercenaries, paid assassins. Now, 11 years ago, they took my daughter. She just recently turned 16, and he allowed her to fly here to Fairbanks to find me. But his intention was not to let her go, but to capture me. I fear that Jack is walking right into a trap, and he has my daughter and her boyfriend with him. I see, Carl said, raising his eyebrows. Just then the truck lurched, and Carl pulled to the shoulder, the thudding sound unmistakable. A flat tire, Carl muttered, throwing the truck into park and grabbing the jack from behind the seat. I'll get this fixed as fast as I can. Sasha got out to stretch her legs, pacing back and forth in front of the truck, the headlights illuminating her figure, while Julian helped change the tire. A glimmer of headlights appeared in the distance, coming from the opposite direction. Sasha's pulse quickened, the fear of being seen still fresh in her mind. The truck sped past, then screeched its tires, and it came to a halt just yards past Carl's truck. Sasha gasped as Jack jumped out of the truck and came running towards her. "Jack," she yelled, throwing her arms around him. Juanita jumped out of the truck and stood in the road, watching as Nadia and Igor climbed out of Jack's truck. "What happened? Where were you?" Jack asked, looking at Sasha closely to see if she was injured. Nadia rushed to Sasha and hugged her. Sasha held her daughter for a moment, then turned back to face Jack. "Oh, Jack, Vitya's here. He had me kidnapped, and he's coming for us," Sasha exclaimed. "Not anymore, he isn't," Jack said, nodding his head towards the truck. He glanced at Carl, the only stranger in the bunch, wondering just how much he should say in front of him. He walked over to Carl and he stuck out his hand. "I'm Jack." Sasha rushed over. "This is Carl. He's a friend of Grizzly's. He saved my life." Carl stood and shook Jack's hand. "I'm mighty glad to meet you, Jack." "Well, let's get this tire fixed," Jack replied. "You got a load of people here," Carl remarked. "How about I drive back up to Grizzly's with you? I'll take Juanita and Julian with me. We'll meet you back at the house." Sasha gave Carl a hug. "Thank you for everything, Carl. I don't know how I can repay your kindness." "We can talk about that later. I'm still thinking about that change we talked about." Within a few minutes, they were back on the road, heading for home. As the miles rolled by, Sasha told Jack what had transpired after the kidnapping, and how she had gotten caught in Carl's wolf trap, and how she had transformed in front of him to prevent being shot. "Well, you're just lucky you're alive," Jack replied, reaching over and taking Sasha's hand. "So tell me, what happened when you got to the safe house? Was Vitya there?" Jack nodded his head, his expression troubled. "I wanted to question him, to find out where you were, but an enormous white wolf appeared out of nowhere and, took care of things before I could get any answers." Sasha's brow was furrowed at that. "Where is he?" she asked. "Which one?" Jack replied. "Vitya or the wolf?" "Vitya's in the back," Nadia replied. "He's dead, Mom. We're free." Sasha glanced in the back seat at her daughter and put her hand over her mouth to stifle a sob. Tears filled her eyes. She fought hard to steady her breathing. The possibility, just the possibility that Vitya was truly gone, that they were finally free, it felt almost too much to believe. Her fingers trembled as she clung to Jack's hand, holding on as if he were her anchor in the storm that still raged within her. After a long silence, she looked at Jack with questioning eyes. "Did you say a wolf killed him?" "God, it was just the strangest thing. It just appeared from the darkness just as Vitya was about to shoot your daughter. It lunged at him just as he fired. The bullet ended up only grazing Natya's head, The wolf ripped open Vitya's throat, and then it turned and looked straight at me and bounded off into the forest. It's much bigger than a normal wolf. Honestly, I think it's one of us, or at least one like us, Jack said. Natya filled her mother in on everything that had transpired back at the house since she had left with Juanita for Fairbanks the day she was captured. She told her how Vitya's men had appeared and how they had fought and killed them, and how a giant white wolf had shown up at just the right moment and killed 2 of the men. "Who is this wolf?" Sasha asked. "Hell if I know," Jack replied, "and we don't know for certain that it's the same wolf, but it certainly seems to be showing up just when we need it." Jack took a glance over at Sasha, shook his head in disbelief. "I'm just so glad to have you back. I really wasn't certain we'd be able to find you." "I can't believe you just showed up like that. Thank goodness Carl had a flat tire. We might have passed each other and not even slowed down." Igor, in his hesitant voice, told Sasha that Miguel was attempting to get the jewel back from the Mavka, but now that Vitya was dead, maybe that would all be forgotten. Sasha glanced at Igor and shook her head. That jewel has brought nothing but bad luck. I'm afraid that until it is returned to the Kremlin, someone will come looking for it. If not Vitya and the organization, then Putin will send someone else after me. Jack looked in the rearview mirror at Igor. "I agree with Sasha. If Miguel can get that jewel back from the Mavka, and that's a big if, then we'll need to figure out a way to return it to Russia without putting ourselves in danger. And don't think that just because Vitya is dead that the organization's going to die with him. They'll have new leadership in no time, and someone will come looking for his body. I don't think we're out of the frying pan quite yet. We need to keep our wits about us." He turned and he looked at Sasha. "Sending you to Fairbanks was careless on my part. I should never have sent you there with Juanita, and I'm not about to take a risk like that again." Jack's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles white in the dim glow from the dashboard. The truck rumbled over a stretch of rough gravel, jostling them all in their seats. Sasha leaned back, sighing as the full weight of their predicament settled on her shoulders. "And the Mavka," she said softly. "Miguel just may not understand what he's gotten himself into. The forest spirits don't let go of something once they've claimed it. She might ask more of him than he realizes." Jack's gaze darkened as he thought about his friend facing down the mysterious Mavka. "Miguel's stubborn, and he's smart. He knows how to take care of himself. But when it comes to woman, he doesn't always think with his head," he chuckled. Far off in the distance, a wolf's howl cut through the silence of the night, its mournful cry echoing through the trees, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Back at the big log house, Grizzly was getting worried that Miguel had not returned. It was easy to get lost in these woods, and Miguel was not familiar with the area. He hoped he wouldn't have to go searching for him. With his bum leg, it would be difficult to navigate the narrow path through the forest. He turned on all the outdoor lights, hoping that the illumination would guide Miguel home. Rosa, she'd been pacing all afternoon. Now that it was quite dark outside, she was a wreck. Miguel was like a son to her, and she couldn't hide her worry. Grizzly tried his best to assure her that Miguel would be just fine, but he could see in her eyes she didn't believe him. Grizzly had always been more comfortable with the wild than with people. He could track a bear through a snowstorm, navigate a river blindfolded, and survive the kind of brutal winters that sent most folks packing back south. He had lived the hard life of the Alaska frontiersman until he met Jezebel. She was hard and tough like he was. He loved everything about her, and when she died, his world had ended. But Rosa, she was something else entirely. She was fierce, sharp-tongued, but she had a softness about her that Grizzly couldn't shake, no matter how much he tried. The first time Rosa handed him a batch of freshly made chocolate chip cookies with her unmistakably warm smile, he was hooked. Tonight, as the fire crackled in the grand fireplace, he could feel his pulse quicken as Rosa poured him a hot cup of coffee. He reached out and he gently grabbed her wrist and looked deeply into her eyes. "He's going to be okay, Rosa, and if he doesn't show up in the next hour or so, I'll head out looking for him." "No, Grizz, it's too dark and, well, I don't want to lose both of you," Rosa replied. Grizzly cleared his throat, feeling a bit of a heat creep up in his neck. All these years since Jesse had died, he'd prided himself on needing no one, relying on nothing but his own grit and skill. Yet here she was, Rosa, with her gentle teasing and easy warmth, making him feel like maybe he'd been missing something. "So, Grizzly," she started, breaking the silence, "tell me why you decided to live way out here in the middle of nowhere." He took a long sip of his coffee, eyes fixed on the flames as he gave it a thought. "I guess it's because out here I can just be. Don't gotta answer to no one, don't gotta fit into no boxes. The wild doesn't care about a man's past or his troubles. It just lets him be." Rosa nodded, her gaze softening. "That sounds mighty nice, but doesn't it get lonely?" Grizzly hesitated. It was the question he'd been avoiding, the truth he'd buried beneath years of hardened resolve. But somehow, with Rosa sitting right there across from him, he couldn't lie. "Yeah, maybe it does." They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds a crackling fire and the quiet hum of the kettle cooling on the stove. After what felt like an eternity, Grizzly reached over and put his hand over Rosa's. He looked down at her hand, her skin warm and soft against his own. He lifted his gaze to meet hers, and for a moment they just looked at each other, the unspoken words hanging in the air. "Rosa," he said, his voice rough, "I ain't a man who's good with words, or people for that matter, but I reckon I don't mind having you around. More than don't mind, if I'm being honest." She laughed softly, a blush coloring her cheek. "Well, that's a start, Grizzly. I don't mind being around either. More than don't mind." The corners of his mouth twitched into a smile. Why, that's a rare sight on that grizzled old face. Without thinking, he reached up, brushing a stray strand of graying hair from her face, his fingers lingering a moment. Before he could talk himself out of it, he leaned in, his rough beard brushing against her cheek, and he pressed a hesitant kiss to her lips. Miguel's heart raced as that Mavka's words echoed in his mind. A child. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath, as if every tree and shadow was waiting for his response. He could feel the chill of her touch lingering on his skin, and for a moment he was unsure if he was still standing on solid ground or if he'd been pulled into some otherworldly dream. "You want a child?" he asked her, his voice unsteady and barely more than a whisper. He stepped back, trying to break the spell that she held over him, but her fingers tightened around his wrist, holding on to him firmly. The Mavka smiled and slowly nodded her head. "But you have children already," Miguel quickly replied. I've seen them, running through the forest, darting in and around the trees." "I have no children," the Mavka replied. "The children you've seen belong to my sisters. I have many, many sisters in the forest, but I have no children of my own." "There are others like you?" Miguel asked. "Why do we not see them? Where do you live?" "Our world is different than yours," the Mavka replied. "We live in caves or abandoned cabins or sheds. We are the watchers of the woods, the guardians of the forest, and you won't see us unless we choose to be seen." Miguel swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words. The jewel, the cross, they seemed insignificant compared to the price that she demanded. He knew he had to choose his words carefully. But a child is more than a gift. It's a life, a human life, a lifetime of responsibility, and that's not to be given lightly, he replied, his voice trembling slightly. What do you gain from this? A child born of both worlds, she murmured, her voice low and seductive. One who will be bound to the forest and to the world of men. Your child would walk between realms and give me new life. The Mavka's gaze had softened. I am bound to this place, to these woods. My existence is limited, like a candle burning in the dark, but with your child, I could live freely in your world and my own. And Miguel felt torn. He needed the jewel, but could he pay such a price? His mind raced around as he tried to think of an alternative. He met her gaze, his voice filled with desperation and defiance. There's got to be another way. The Mavka's laughter rang out again, but this time it was softer, almost sad. She traced a line along his jaw, her touch both gentle and cold. Then I will give you a choice, little fox. Return to me at the next full moon with your answer. Either accept my offer and give me what I desire, or find a way to retrieve the jewel without my help. But be warned, the forest has a mind of its own, and it does not take kindly to thieves. With that, the Mavka just vanished, leaving Miguel alone in the clearing, the air heavy with the weight of her words. He stood there, heart pounding, as the forest around him seemed to close in, the trees whispering secrets he was not meant to hear. As he made his way back towards the house, his thoughts churned. How could he face Rosa and tell her that he had lost her cross? And how would they save Sasha if he didn't bring back the jewel? What would happen to the 2 Russian kids if he didn't come through with his end of this twisted bargain? As impossible as it seemed, he knew he had to find a way to recover the jewel and keep his humanity intact. The stakes were too high. With an ache in his stomach, he took a deep breath, steadying himself, then called out into the dense shadowed trees. Mavka, wait! Silence fell, a hush that blanketed the forest as if every creature within it held its breath. Miguel felt a tremor of fear. He knew she would come eventually. And just as he began to doubt himself, the air shifted, growing colder, and the scent of damp earth and wildflowers filled his senses. And from the shadows, once again, the Mavka materialized, her ethereal form gliding towards him with a faint, otherworldly glow. Her eyes, sharp and endless, locked onto his with an intensity that made him shiver. So, she purred with a smile curving her lips, the little fox has made up his mind. Have you decided to accept my offer? Miguel took a steadying breath, clenching his fists. I can't give you a child, he said firmly, though his voice trembled. But I'm willing to offer you something else. I'm willing to swear myself to you. I'll be bound to this forest to serve and to protect it, and you, whatever you need of me, just give me the jewel and I'll be yours. The Mavka's face softened, a glint of intrigue in her gaze. She circled him slowly, her fingertips grazing his shoulder, leaving a trail of icy prickles. Interesting. And what makes you think your loyalty alone would be enough? She asked him, her voice a low murmur. Miguel swallowed, summoning all of his courage. I know I'm only a man, but I have skills that could be useful to you. I know how to fight. I know how to survive. I can protect this place, protect you, if that's what you want. He looked her squarely in the eye, trying to hold her gaze. I'm offering my life, Mavka. Just please let me have the jewel. Her gaze lingered on him, and for a moment he saw something flicker in her expression, an emotion he couldn't quite place, something close to curiosity or perhaps even pity. She tilted her head, considering his words, and her lips pursing in thought. Very well, she finally said, her voice softer, almost thoughtful. You will serve me, body and soul, until the forest itself decides to release you. But know this, once you enter into this pact, there will be no escape. You will feel the heartbeat of the woods. You will answer to every cry of pain, every whisper of sorrow. It will be your burden as much as mine. Miguel hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. But then he thought of Rosa, of the friends who were now his family, of the lives he might be able to save with that jewel in hand. He nodded slowly, his voice steady. I accept. The Mavka smiled, her eyes gleamed with a dark satisfaction. She reached up and pressed her hand over his heart, and he felt a rush of cold that seeped into his very bones. The forest seemed to grow darker around them, the trees swaying as if in acknowledgement of the bond now forged. Then it is done, she whispered, and from the shadows she produced the jewel, gleaming with an otherworldly light. She held it out to him, watching as he reached for it with trembling hands. But as his fingers closed around the jewel, a shudder passed through him, a sudden awareness of every root, every leaf, every drop of life in the forest around him. He could feel the ancient spirit of the woods pulsing through his veins, binding him irrevocably to this land. The Mavka stepped back, her gaze still fixed on him, softer now. You've chosen well, little fox, she said, her voice almost tender. Go now, and remember, your life is no longer your own. It belongs to the forest, and it belongs to me. With that, she faded into the shadows, leaving Miguel alone once more, the jewel cold and heavy in his hand, and the forest alive in his blood.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode, and I hope we'll see you all here next week for the next installment of the Wolfman Chronicles. Have a great week, everyone.